The 7 most high guests Johnny Carson ever had. You won't believe. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was late-night royalty. Clean laughs, polished guests, clockwork timing. But behind that iconic blue curtain, chaos. Real chaos. The kind you can't script, even if some guests tried. Carson had a radar for it. One glance, and he'd know if someone was drunk, stoned, or wired on something stronger. Staff had secret signals, like Johnny adjusting his tie to warn the crew, "This one's loaded." The stakes were sky high. A good segment could launch a career. A bad one could end it. Some celebrities turned to liquid courage. Others needed pills, powder, or whatever would quiet the nerves. And once the cameras rolled, Johnny had to make it all look smooth, even when things went sideways. Some guests delivered comic gold in a haze. Others unraveled in real time. And a few pushed things so far, they never came back. These are the 7 most notoriously altered guests Johnny Carson ever faced, and how he kept the show from falling apart live on air. Starting with the high-functioning king of counterculture, George Carlin. Number 1. George Carlin, the high-functioning philosopher. By the time George Carlin hit The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, he wasn't just a comedian, he was a full-blown cultural movement with a beard, a joint, and a microphone. This was the guy who went from suit-and-tie jokester to a long-haired, language-bending counterculture messiah. He ditched the network-safe bits, stopped shaving, and started telling the truth, his truth. It was angry, funny, weird, and at times brilliantly uncomfortable. He wasn't just doing stand-up anymore. He was channeling something raw, something unfiltered, something often enhanced, and he brought that same unpredictable electricity into Johnny Carson's studio. There was no need to speculate. Carlin later admitted it flat out. "Was I usually stoned during my Carson spots in the 70s? Of course I was. It was the 70s, and I was George Carlin. Do the math." But unlike the cautionary tales that would follow him on this list, Carlin was functional. Not a mess. Not incoherent. Just tuned to a different frequency. Producers on The Tonight Show knew exactly what was going on. One even called him a functioning herbalist. And it showed. Carlin would sit down with Johnny, eyes slightly glazed, voice relaxed, and then go. Unscripted. Unstoppable. He'd rant about airports, language, politics, religion, all of it laced with a slow-burning wit that audiences couldn't get enough of. He was so good, in fact, that Johnny booked him over 130 times. That's not a typo, 130. But there was a ceiling. Carson, who often tapped his favorite comedians to guest host the show when he was off, never once handed the reins to Carlin. Why? Because Johnny respected the talent, but questioned the discipline. He could trust George to deliver a segment, but 90 minutes of live television? With Carlin in full control? That was a risk he never took. Behind the scenes, it was all about containment. Carson would loosen the format when Carlin was on. He'd avoid tight questions. He'd open the gates and let Carlin riff, trusting that something gold would tumble out. And it usually did. The audience didn't just laugh. They leaned in. Carlin had this way of saying things no one else would, in ways no one else could. He made you laugh, then made you think. And the slight dazed look in his eyes? It wasn't a liability. It was part of the performance. What made Carlin so dangerous and so brilliant was that he didn't lose control. He operated right on the edge, but never fell over. If anything, his buzz seemed to unlock something deeper. And Johnny knew it. He'd light up a segment in ways no sober comic could, one staffer said. But you had to trust the roller coaster wouldn't derail. And it didn't. But the next guest? He brought the same kind of genius but with a volatility that even Carson couldn't predict. Richard Pryor was coming in hot. Number 2. Richard Pryor. Genius on the edge. If George Carlin hovered just above reality, Richard Pryor crashed through it head first, sparks flying, no seatbelt. Pryor was chaos in a suit, a human live wire. Every sentence could detonate. Every pause could lead to either a thunderous laugh or a moment so uncomfortable you forgot to breathe. You never watched a Pryor interview. You survived it. And Johnny Carson? He knew it the moment Richard sat down. You could see it in Carson's posture, slightly more upright, eyes narrowed, always ready to pivot. Pryor was raw, brilliant, and painfully unpredictable. And sometimes, He was high. Not giggly high. Not mellow high. No, volcanic high. Most often on cocaine. And it showed. One legendary interview in 1978 started with electric energy. Richard was sharp, hilarious, spitting one-liners like a machine gun. The audience was eating it up. Carson relaxed, let him run. But then right in the middle of a bit about his childhood, something changed. Richard's eyes glazed. His words slowed. Then came a stutter, a long pause, a nervous laugh, and then nothing, just silence. He stared at the floor. The room froze. Johnny didn't blink. He jumped in with a redirect. "So tell me about the movie you just wrapped." Pryor blinked, looked up, smiled too wide, and launched into a completely unrelated story about ghosts. Ghosts. Johnny smiled. The audience laughed, uneasy, unsure if it was part of the act. But Carson knew. He was shifting gears in real time. You could feel him taking control, guiding Pryor with humor, with soft questions, with fast transitions. He tossed to commercial a full 2 minutes early without missing a beat. Backstage, there was no outrage, no gossip, just a closed-door conversation between Carson and his producer. "He's hurting. If it gets worse, we pull the plug." Because Carson didn't just admire Richard's comedy, he cared, enough to ask friends to check in on him, enough to never exploit the spiral, enough to protect his legacy, even when Pryor was actively torching it. A former NBC exec recalled, Johnny said, "I'll never be the reason Richard falls apart on air." And he meant it. And here's what makes Pryor's appearances so legendary. Even at his worst, there was still flashes of genius, moments that no other comic could deliver. A flicker of truth wrapped in fire. But you never knew if he'd land the joke or self-destruct halfway through. Carson didn't need hand signals for Richard. He had instinct. He could see it in the man's eyes the moment he walked out. Some nights Richard was there fast, cutting, real. Other nights he was in pieces, and Johnny's job was to catch him, or at least not let him fall too hard. What Pryor brought to The Tonight Show wasn't just comedy. It was risk, and Carson handled it with grace that most hosts couldn't dream of. But risk has its limits. And the next guest, he didn't flirt with the edge. He stumbled in drunk, collapsed into disaster, and never got invited back. Number 3. Truman Capote. The collapse on live TV. Truman Capote used to float through talk shows like he owned them. Glittering wit, razor-sharp comebacks, and that voice, soft, sly, and cutting beneath the surface. He was a regular on The Tonight Show, and for years Carson welcomed him like an old friend. But in January 1980, that friend didn't show up. Someone else did. Capote walked onto the stage that night already unraveling. His steps were slow, his posture slumped, his eyes refused to focus. From the second he slurred his way through the opening greeting, the studio felt it. Something was very wrong. He wasn't tipsy, one sound tech later said. He was gone, barely tethered to the set. Carson did what Carson always did. He tried to hold the segment together. He simplified his questions, asked slow, waited long, gave Truman chances to find his rhythm. But it never came. Capote mumbled responses that made no sense. His sentences collapsed mid-phrase. He stared into the audience like he wasn't sure where he was. In the control room, chaos. Producers signaled camera ops to cut between wide shots, hoping to disguise Capote's vacant gaze. One assistant whispered a countdown to commercial, stalling until Johnny gave the subtle cue, tapping his pencil twice against his desk. It was time to get out. Fast. When the commercial hit, Carson didn't say a word. He stood up, walked off set, and headed straight to the green room. "Never again," he told the talent coordinator. "He's done." The rage was quiet, but surgical. Johnny wasn't angry because Truman was drunk. He was angry because he showed zero respect, not for the audience, not for the crew, and not for the platform. There's a difference between a guest who's loose and one who's useless. Carson made that distinction sharp as a blade. Capote had been beloved by America's literary world. But in that moment, he became a live television liability. And Johnny didn't just cut him off, he erased him. Capote never appeared on The Tonight Show again. Not a single segment rerun. No mentions. gone. Producers tightened green room rules after that night. Alcohol was limited. Staff were told to report signs of heavy impairment. The Capote collapse had rattled even the most seasoned team. What made it worse? The contrast. Capote wasn't always like this. Just months earlier, he'd come on and delivered a perfect 8-minute segment. Witty, odd, charismatic. But now, he could barely string two thoughts together. NBC executives later admitted they considered cutting the feed live. It was that bad. And Johnny never forgot it. He treated it as a turning point. He could guide a stoner. He could redirect a spiraling comic. But he wouldn't babysit someone who showed up wrecked and expected him to carry it. Capote's band sent a message across Hollywood. You could bring your flaws, but you'd better bring something else too. Insight, energy, humor, something. Because if you showed up with nothing but slurred words and a glazed stare, you didn't come back. The next guests, though, they didn't try to hide behind charm or pretend sobriety. They were loud and proud about what was in their system. Number 4, Cheech Chong. Truth and Smoke. Cheech Chong didn't pretend to be clean. They didn't hide their lifestyle or sneak their habits past security. They walked into the Tonight Show studio with the same cloud of smoke that followed them everywhere else and made America laugh harder than it ever expected to. These two weren't characters, they were their characters. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong built an empire on weed jokes, slow delivery, spaced-out confusion, and absurd tangents. And when they hit the couch across from Johnny Carson, they didn't change a thing. One producer said it best. They weren't acting, that's just how their brains operated. And Carson? He understood the assignment. He didn't clean them up. He didn't ask them to tone it down. He leaned in. Johnny would play the bewildered square, the confused, clean-cut host, trying to keep up with two guys who seemed like they had just wandered out of a VW bus parked behind the studio. Every time Chong lost the thread of a story, Johnny smirked. Every time Cheech drifted into a strange stoner anecdote about talking dogs or drifting smoke signals, Johnny offered just enough of a reaction to keep the joke moving. It was masterful misdirection, the audience laughing not at Cheech and Chong, but with Johnny's straight-man reactions to their unpredictability. He knew they were toasted. They knew he knew, and nobody cared. During one of their most infamous appearances, Chong spent nearly 5 minutes trying to describe how filming Up in Smoke felt like floating through jelly. Johnny just nodded, raised an eyebrow, and turned to the audience with a deadpan expression that brought the house down. That was the magic. Carson didn't expose them, he amplified them. But backstage, there were always nerves. Producers were briefed in advance. No tight timing. No serious political questions. Keep it loose. Let them wander. Segment coordinators would literally build in padding for commercial breaks in case Chong got lost mid-sentence. And yet, it always worked. Why? Because Cheech and Chong never promised to be sharp. Their entire brand was being out of it. And America loved them for it. Carson respected that. He wasn't there to sanitize pop culture. He was there to reflect it. And during the late 70s and early 80s, these two were pop culture bong in hand, eyes half open, and timing just fuzzy enough to still hit the punchline. A camera operator once joked, they were the only guests who didn't need makeup. The haze covered everything. But here's the real twist. Cheech and Chong weren't fools. They were smart comics in dumb disguises. Their act may have looked like chaos, but underneath the giggles was precision. They knew their audience, and Johnny knew how to use them. Unlike the tragic spirals of Capote or the unpredictable fireworks of Pryor, Cheech and Chong brought controlled madness, and Carson let it breathe. The next guest, though, he wasn't mellow. He wasn't in control. He came in seeing sounds, talking to lights, and bending time itself, all on live television. Number 5. Peter Fonda. Lost in the Cosmic Static. Peter Fonda didn't sit down for an interview that night. He arrived in another reality. It was 1970, the height of the counterculture wave, and Fonda was its cinematic prophet. Easy Rider had turned him into a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and psychedelic exploration. Everyone knew he experimented, but no one expected him to bring the full trip onto Johnny Carson's stage. From the moment he walked out, crew members exchanged looks. His pupils were blown wide. His movements were slow but deliberate, like he was underwater. He stared at the studio lights as if they were communicating with him. When Johnny welcomed him, Fonda smiled, but didn't respond, not right away. He looked like he was tuning into a radio station nobody else could hear. One cameraman later said, "Carson adjusted immediately. His voice softened. His questions became simpler. He slowed the rhythm of the interview like a man walking alongside someone who might stumble at any second." But even that wasn't enough. When Johnny asked a routine question about Fonda's upcoming film, the response didn't come in sentences. It came in waves. Fonda started talking about time. Not deadlines, not schedules. Time itself. How it wasn't linear. How it folded in on itself. How everyone in the room was riding a cosmic loop they didn't even realize existed. The audience laughed nervously. Some thought it was a bit. Others weren't sure if they were witnessing performance art or a breakdown. Johnny didn't laugh. He glanced at his desk cards. Then, tap tap. That was the signal. Cut to commercial. Immediately. The interview was scheduled for 12 minutes. It lasted 5. When the show came back, Fonda was gone. No explanation. No joke. No awkward follow-up. Carson simply introduced the next guest, like nothing unusual had happened. To the viewers at home, it felt abrupt. To the people in the studio, it felt like relief. Backstage, there was no shouting, no banning, just a quiet acknowledgement that this had gone too far. "Everyone has off nights," Carson told his producers. "We'll try again another time." And he did. Fonda returned to The Tonight Show in later years, sober, articulate, and grounded. The infamous appearance faded into lore, a whispered story among crew members and television historians. That was Johnny's way. He didn't punish vulnerability. He didn't humiliate confusion. He simply removed the spotlight before it became cruel. But not every guest was afforded that grace. Because the next one didn't just drift into chaos, he charged into it. Loud, aggressive, and dangerously unpredictable. Number 6. Oliver Reed. When chaos turned threatening, Oliver Reed didn't come to The Tonight Show to entertain. He came like a ticking bomb. By 1975, Reed's reputation was already infamous. Brilliant actor, uncontrollable temper, and a drinking habit that bordered on self-destruction. British tabloids loved him. Hollywood tolerated him. Johnny Carson, he was cautious. From the moment Reed stepped onto the stage, the warning signs were everywhere. His speech was thick, his movements exaggerated. His confidence wasn't charm, it was confrontation. Johnny opened with a light question, hoping to ease him in. Reed interrupted before the sentence even finished. That was the first red flag. Then came the volume. Reed leaned forward, talked over Johnny, laughed at his own remarks, and waved his arms wildly. The audience chuckled at first. Johnny smiled politely, but behind the desk, his body language shifted. Subtle, controlled, alert. He realized fast this wasn't a funny drunk, a stage manager later said. This was someone who could snap. The breaking point came suddenly. Reed stood up. No warning, no joke. He planted his feet and raised his fists, half shadowboxing, half posturing. It wasn't playful, it wasn't planned, it was instinct. Security moved in. The band stiffened. The studio went silent. Johnny didn't raise his voice, he didn't laugh it off. He took control. He interrupted Reed mid-rant, firmly redirected the conversation, and steered the segment toward an early exit. No banter, no indulgence, just containment. When the cameras cut, Carson was done. This isn't television, he told producers. This is a liability, unlike other guests on this list. Reed didn't get compassion. He didn't get a second chance. Carson didn't care how famous he was or how many films he'd starred in. Once a guest made the studio feel unsafe, the relationship was over. A former talent coordinator later revealed Carson's rule. The moment someone turns hostile or unpredictable in a threatening way, they're finished. Oliver Reed never returned to The Tonight Show, and that decision echoed through Hollywood. Carson wasn't just protecting his audience, he was protecting his crew. Cameras, cables, musicians, assistants. Live television leaves no room for violence, masquerading as entertainment. Reed's appearance wasn't remembered as edgy or bold. It was remembered as uncomfortable, as tense, as a moment where laughter drained out of the room, and Johnny Carson made sure it never happened again. But the final guest on this list wasn't banned. He wasn't dangerous. He didn't lose control. He was something else entirely. A man so charged with energy, so electrically alive on camera. Number 7. Sammy Davis Jr. The human fireball. Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't just a performer. He was performance. He didn't walk onto Johnny Carson's stage in 1974. He launched onto it like a Vegas show light come to life. Fast-talking, animated, bursting with energy so intense it almost didn't fit inside his body. Even in a room filled with stars, Sammy burned brighter than everyone. But on this night something felt he was sweating under the lights more than usual. His words came out like machine gun fire. Stories within stories, punchlines inside tangents, a whirlwind of movement that barely paused to breathe. To the audience, it was vintage Sammy. Electrifying, hilarious, unstoppable. To the crew, it raised eyebrows. Sound techs whispered. Assistants glanced toward the green room. One of them later said, "He was going so fast, we couldn't tell if it was genius or something else." Backstage, speculation was everywhere. By the mid-1970s, cocaine had become Hollywood's favorite invisible co-star. It kept you sharp, or at least it made you feel sharp. And Sammy? He was razor-edged that night, blazing through jokes, veering off topic, doubling back, his eyes darting around the room like he was chasing thoughts in real time. Carson never missed a beat. He didn't flinch. He didn't slow him down. He flowed with him. It was like watching a jazz duo, where one player was on triple time and the other kept time without blinking. Johnny asked broad questions, nodded through impossible answers, and somehow made it work. When the segment ended, Johnny wiped his brow and cracked to the crew, "I think I need a nap just from listening to him." Everyone laughed, but the subtext lingered. Something had definitely fueled that performance. Yet unlike Capote or Reed, Sammy Davis Jr. never lost control. He never became incoherent. He didn't forget where he was or threaten the furniture. He simply cranked his own volume to maximum and stayed there. He gave a show, one that lived right on the edge of too much, but never quite tipped over. Carson never addressed the rumors. Not on air, not to press, but insiders knew there were signs. The unusually long green room visit. The way Sammy's speech jumped octaves mid-story. The sudden gear shifts from comedy to sincerity and back again. But here's the thing. Johnny didn't care. Because Sammy performed. He delivered. He understood the stakes. And no matter what was coursing through his system, he never let the show slip. As one producer put it, if something was in him, it didn't derail him. It unleashed him. And Sammy never confirmed anything. When asked in a later interview if he'd ever used anything before hitting a late-night stage, he smiled and said, "Baby, the 70s were the 70s. That's all I'm saying," with a wink. And no apology. Because what mattered to Johnny Carson wasn't purity, it was performance. And in that moment, with the audience howling and the cameras rolling, Sammy Davis Jr. was nothing short of unstoppable. What these 7 guests proved. George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Truman Capote, Cheech Chong, Peter Fonda, Oliver Reed, and Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't just that fame and substance often walked hand in hand. It was that live television, in the hands of Johnny Carson, could absorb it all and still stay standing. He didn't humiliate. He didn't scold. He adapted. When Carlin floated into philosophical rants with glazed eyes and quiet brilliance, Johnny leaned back and let him roll. When Pryor unraveled mid-sentence, Johnny stepped in, not to save the segment, but to protect the man. When Capote collapsed into slurs and vacant stares, Johnny cut it short and drew the line. When Cheech Chong stumbled through smoky stories, Johnny gave them space to be themselves and let the audience laugh with them, not at them. When Peter Fonda melted into cosmic rambling, Carson didn't panic. He just tapped his cards and moved on. When Oliver Reed turned volatile, Johnny shut it down immediately. And when Sammy Davis Jr. nearly burned a hole through the stage with his hyperactive charisma, Johnny grinned, adjusted his tie, and kept up beat for beat. Carson didn't judge his guests by what was in their system. He judged them by one thing: could they still respect the moment? Because The Tonight Show wasn't just a talk show, it was a test, a live wire, a national stage where millions were watching and only the sharpest survived. And Johnny, sitting at that desk, was more than a host. He was a referee, a protector, and sometimes a last line of defense between a celebrity and their own implosion. He once said, "People don't tune in to see you crash. They tune in to see you fly." But if you did crash, Johnny made sure it happened with your dignity mostly intact. He might cut you short. He might never invite you back. But he wouldn't let the audience watch you bleed. In today's world, these moments would be dissected, memed, clipped, and thrown into the social media fire pit. But back then, they lived and died in the studio because Johnny Carson understood that television wasn't about punishment. It was about performance.